I'd like to introduce you to two little girls. This is Elizabeth. You'll have to imagine her. She's here. And this is Emily on my other side. So Elizabeth lives in a rural village in a big round hut that her family made. It's made out of mud and cow manure. It's pretty dark in the hut, but there's a fire in the centre. And that fire needs to keep burning all day long in order to make sure that families stay warm and that they've got enough ability to kind of cook all their meals. Elizabeth spends her whole days going to get firewood to keep this fire going. It's a really treacherous journey. It takes her at least an hour to go back and forth, but it's what she needs to do. And Elizabeth, as she's walking back to her hut one day, is sort of staring up at the sky and just really thinking about what she'd rather be doing. She'd much rather be going to school, but she just hasn't got the ability to do that because she's got her duties for the family, and she's really dreaming big. Emily, on the other hand, and her small immediate family of 4 live in a pretty big house in the countryside. She goes to a great school, has loads of wonderful friends, does lots of music and sport. And she's also walking back from school one day to home, and she's also staring up at the sky and she's thinking, well, I wonder what my future holds. I think I'd probably quite like to be a doctor, but equally, I don't need to make those decisions now. She just knows that whatever she wants to achieve, she can do. There's no limits to her dreams. Well, I'm sure you've guessed that the Emily I'm talking about is myself. Yeah, I wanted to sort of to illustrate that Emily and Elizabeth, they have a really important thing in common. They just live in the here and now like little girls do, but they're dreaming of their future. But only one of them has the access to an education, and only one of them really has the means to be able to achieve their future and achieve their dreams. And I'm not just talking about fluffy dreams and aspirations. The difference between them really is the access to essential infrastructure. So I guess I'm talking about access to education and healthcare and roads and railways and running water and such like. We take that for granted completely. The actual infrastructure gap, which is trying to make sure that everybody in the world has access to infrastructure, exists, and it really is estimated to be about $2.7 trillion worth of money needed to bridge that infrastructure gap. It's a huge amount of money required. It's about 8% of the global GDP. So you may not recognize yourself in either Emily or Elizabeth, but this really is a global problem that we share and we need to find a solution to. So where can we find that money to bridge the infrastructure gap? Where can we find this $2.7 trillion? Well, you normally think of that as the job of governments. You expect governments to be building the roads and the railways and the hospitals, etc. But of course, those people living in extreme poverty, like Elizabeth, they're also living in the poorest countries in the world. And those countries just don't have the financial resources and capabilities to build that sort of infrastructure. It's estimated that about 700 million people in the world are living in extreme poverty, like Elizabeth. So that's 1 in 10 of the global population. It's just a staggering number. And I'm sure that many of you have heard of the psychologist Abraham Maslow, who in the 40s determined that there was a hierarchy of needs that needed to be met in order for a human to achieve their full potential. There's 5 different tiers to meet. And really, people who are in extreme poverty struggle to get themselves out of that very first tier, which is the physiological one. So that's, just keeping yourself warm and making sure you've got enough food and water. And without being able to meet that base level of need, they've absolutely got no chance of kind of being able to go up those tiers and to achieve their full potential. And so we've got to find a way of changing that. Yeah, so I've said already that there's not enough money in those countries, but I do know there is enough money out there. And the place where we can find that money is the private sector. As an example, IKEA, a couple of years ago said, we'll put $2.8 billion into some renewable energy infrastructure. We know that we need to offset all the carbon uses, etc., and electricity in our stores, but we want to give back more. So the company that I work with, GuarantCo, partnered with them, and we built some renewable energy in India and the Philippines with them. But why don't more private sector companies do this investment in infrastructure? Well, it really comes down to risk and appetite to risk. Investors often think, well, actually, if I'm trying to find somewhere to put my money, I need to make sure that it's safe. Infrastructure projects are really complex. They take a very long time to build. They may go over budget. And especially if you overlay on the impact of building those in the poorest countries in the world, where they just don't have the sort of experience in building those kind of projects, it's just too much of a risk for the private sector to take on. So that's where companies like the one that I work for, GuarantCo, we are publicly funded, but our mission is to bring private sector money into investing in infrastructure. But is it enough to be helping those countries in the poorest countries in the world with money from the developed world? I'm not so sure. I've sat in so many big fancy boardrooms in swanky skyscrapers in the city with many investors talking about investing in infrastructure. And they're talking about it in really cold kind of clinical terms and wondering about their return on investment and balance sheet risk and financial structuring, etc. In fact, the company I work for is also in one of those fancy skyscrapers in the city of London, right next to the Gherkin. And I find myself in those meetings looking out the window and just thinking about the Elizabeths in the world and her family and wondering, is it right that we, in our skyscrapers many miles away, are determining the fates and futures of those out in the poorest countries in the world? I really want to find a way of unlocking the private sector money and the entrepreneurial thinking within those countries themselves that are in that extreme poverty. That would be extremely powerful. So when I first joined GuarantCo about 3.5 years ago, I was really lucky to do a trip out to Ghana. I met a really interesting local entrepreneur called Emmanuel, and he's already had a successful business, and he identified a gap that he wanted to do a clean gas terminal, but with a really important byproduct. The spare clean gas could be used for cooking within cook stoves, and then replacing, therefore, all the firewood fires in the huts like Elizabeth and her family had. So he thought, well, this is a great idea, I'm bound to have lots of money available for it, because he didn't have enough capital himself. So off he went to try and find the funding, but actually what he found was he was either offered the funding in the wrong currency, so in dollars instead of his local currency, or the funding was such sort of short length that it didn't give him enough certainty to be able to go ahead with the project. So GuarantCo, the company I work for, came along and said, we will partner with you, Emmanuel, a successful private sector business. We will also partner with the local funders, and we will make sure that actually we will look into the risks and how to mitigate them in your business and make sure that we've got the funders comfortable with it. Emmanuel very gladly accepted and built the clean gas terminal and indeed managed to help all the families like Elizabeth that he wanted to. And it was absolutely wonderful. Elizabeth was able to achieve her dreams. She was able to go to school. So it really shows a local entrepreneur finding local funding in local currency with local private sector funders, with a little bit of help from a public sector organisation, really can unlock the ability to invest in essential infrastructure. And really, Emmanuel, when he succeeds, he sets an advert for what could be achieved if other local entrepreneurs also do the same thing. But I have to say, when I first joined GuarantCo, I really thought it was about building matters and ensuring that we'd met our targets, and that was making sure that we'd had access to infrastructure for a certain number of people, created a certain number of jobs. It was really targets and numbers driven. And the more I looked into development finance and the more I really thought about why we were doing what we were doing, the more I actually realised it's not about the global situation. It's not about the 700 million people in poverty as a global kind of category. It's about the individuals behind it. It's about the Elizabeths and the Emmanuels and finding ways of helping them. Just imagine, of those 700 million brains out there, if they were able to go up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what could they achieve? What potential is sitting out there? You might find there's a cure for cancer in one of their brains, or a wonderful idea to solve the climate change crisis. It's really got to be untapped. So the more I've been wondering about sort of why I do what I do, the more I've realised it's about finding ways of unlocking the potential in others. So my ask of you all, as you go back to your day jobs after today's session, is really to just see beyond the metrics, the KPIs, the deliverables, and really see to the nitty-gritty of why we're doing what we're doing and the heart behind what we do. Seek out the Elizabeths and the Emmanuels. And by doing that, we may find ways of unlocking even more potential in others. Wouldn't that make the world such a better place? Thank you, Claire. Yeah, we'll do it. Thank you.